Hello, Frizzle fans. So, we have read Brandon Sanderson's newest book, the one that is a fantasy romance, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter.
It was so good. I loved it.
And I also loved it, but a little less. But we definitely had a lot of fun reading it. He read it first. Oh, by the way, I'm 𝐂𝐿𝐒.
I'm Seth.
And we are a couple, so reading a romance book together was very fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then he reread it I read it.
I read it twice. It was good enough to read twice in the span of a week?
So he's found a new favorite book, and I found a book that I liked, and we are so excited to take it apart for you now. So here is the premise of this book. We have two protagonists, Painter and Yumi. So Painter has a day job destroying demon nightmares, just the usual. He's really bored about it. And then Yumi is living on a completely different world, and she has a job where she stacks rocks in order to summon spirits that then become the machines of the world. And she's also kind of dissatisfied with her job, but because she doesn't get to do anything for fun ever. And then they get connected and start body swapping.
If Trust in the 𝐂𝐻𝐿𝐒 was a Cosmere Princess Bride, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter is a Cosmere Your Name.
In fact, Brandon Sanderson says in the acknowledgements he was heavily inspired by it, which is a Japanese movie about a couple that starts really body swapping and falls in love over the course of it. And it's very good. Highly recommend the movie.
And this book is about a couple that starts body swapping and falls in love over the course of it.
And it's very much Japanese inspired. You can see those tropes coming through.
Even in the two planets, Painter's world, or Nikaro's world, slightly modern Tokyo with the neon lights and all of the ramen shops, and everyone's got Japanese names, whereas Yumi's world is more ancient Korea, and they've got all these cool things made out of spirits. But another thing that it really reminded me of is a really old video game for PlayStation 1 called Legend of 𝐂𝐿𝐒, particularly the painter side of it, where it's this world shrouded in mysterious substance causing all of these monsters to go crazy. Because of that, I really enjoyed it.
Only because of that, eh? One of the things that this book really nails is the vivid setting on both Painter's world and Yumi's world. So you were talking about Painter's world, where it's all of their electricity is neon.
Everywhere. Instead of power lines, they have keon lines, which are one's teal, one's magenta, always running side by side. Powers their televisions, their public transportation, the neon signs, everything.
It's very neon punk. Painter, bless his heart, is so emo and just the perfect ball of darkness at the beginning.
Much like the planet doesn't have a sun, completely shrouded in darkness.
Meanwhile, on Yumi's world, there's sunlight everywhere. So much sun that heat is a big problem, and everything kind of revolves around not getting too hot.
You have to wear these wooden clogs that are a couple inches off the ground, otherwise your feet will get burned. The plants can't grow on the ground, so they fly.
Their water instead of rain comes from geysers. And that kind of brings us into a big kind of point of this book is the duality between Yumi's life and Painter's life. In so many ways they're opposites, and you can see that even from the foundation of the settings. One is hot, light, and one is cold, darkness. One is very old-timey, we don't need anything else, maybe occasionally a lantern, and then Painter's world is neon everywhere, everything is neon.
Gotta go home to watch my favorite historical dramas on the television. And then of course we get into the more fantastical elements of the different settings. Nightmare's world has what's called the shroud that coats the entire planet, and inside of the shroud are these things called nightmares that emerge and start feeding on people's bad dreams and stuff. And so Nikaro, the nightmare painter, has to go out and use investiture or whatever to force the nightmares into a more calm state.
By painting them.
Whereas on Yumi's world, they're these spirits that get summoned through art, particularly stacking rocks.
Which is really cool, and we'll get into more of this later, that both of the magic systems very much revolve around art. Various Cosmere lore, which we'll also talk about later, because we have both read the entirety of the Cosmere multiple times.
But this duality is also played off of their relative arcs. Painter is his whole thing is that he's been working this job, going out in the middle of the night and dealing with these monsters for almost nothing, and he's just really tired of it. It's kind of rote at this point, just doing bare minimum, whereas Yumi has been working as what's called a yokihijo, the rock stacker to summon spirits. Loves it, she's dedicating her life to it, but she wants a little freedom because there are a lot of rules around her job that she can't really break, otherwise she might displease the spirits, which would be bad.
It's like in Painter's life, he could have adventure. He could be putting more into his work, into his social life, but he's just choosing instead to have the loner routine life. And then Yumi has the loner routine life and is desperately craving a little bit of adventure and getting out of it. Their two arcs where their starting points are balance each other so nicely because they both need what the other one has.
But they play off each other really well.
Yeah, and I personally really liked the way that they got connected, where it wasn't just a Freaky Friday situation where one of them is in one body and one of them is in the other body, because they're on different worlds and then they wouldn't ever really get to interact. Instead, the way it is, Painter wakes up in Yumi's body and Yumi the ghost is also there. And then they're there until they fall asleep and then they're back in Painter's world.
With Yumi in control and Painter as a ghost.
But the funnest little twist that I just love what it does to this book is, in Yumi's world, Painter is in Yumi's body. In Painter's world,
it's still Yumi. She looks like Yumi, is Yumi instead of
yeah.
Painter.
So in both worlds, it's Yumi's body. And then plus ghost. And at first I was like, what? Why? And they do give like a magic explanation, but I think that's less important as the thematic ramifications of what this does, because Yumi has been controlled all of her life as like this ritual priestess, and she doesn't really have any bodily autonomy in her own world.
And now that she's on Painter's world and isn't really confined to his structure like he is to hers on her world, she has to like learn how to make her own decisions. Like, what does she want to do? What does she want from life? And now she has to figure that out.
Right? Because if she had just been in Painter's body, then she would have had to just like go to Painter's day job, pretend to be him. But because she gets her own body, she has to create her own life. Just because it plays in well with her thing. And I was thinking about also like Painter being in Yumi's body in Yumi's world also works, because a lot of his arc is about coming out of his shell and like thinking about others and their feelings and like kind of accommodating them better. Him having to be in Yumi's body and pretending to be her also forces him to learn lessons about working as a team and accommodating other people's wishes. And I think one of my favorite parts of this book was just watching Yumi come out of her shell, watching her learn how to like pick out her own clothes and finding joy in that, and finding joy in like and friends, and just like seeing her find all of these wonderful parts of life that she was missing out on and really take it for herself. When at the beginning of the book, Yumi is like pretty much anti-fun because that's how she's been raised, right? She doesn't want to do anything that could jeopardize her duty. But then slowly she gets to figure out that actually there's quite a lot of things she can do. And then reversing that, Painter's arc, he starts out the cutest little emo boy. Like,
It really does.
There's this scene near the beginning where he encounters some of his like acquaintance friends, and it's hilarious.
He's all like, I really want to like go out to dinner with them because it'd be super fun, but like I can't ask them that, and even if they asked, I could have the pleasure of saying no, but it'd be nice to be asked for once, just so I could turn them down, so that I could be included, but not actually because I'm too emo for that.
And then you think that like, oh, these are probably like the snobby popular kids who would like never ask him or anything.
Yeah, because you've got like the really beautiful one who he's like kind of got a crush on. He's like, she's way too out of my league, I'll never be worthy of her. But then it turns out that they're actually just super nice people and like aren't his rivals at all, and all of it's just in his head.
Which you get to see a little bit from Painter's eyes, but mostly through Yumi's eyes, as she gets to know his coworkers and becomes friends with them, and she's like, wow, Painter said these guys were terrible, but actually they're super nice. And it's just because Painter is putting all of this emo-ness on himself. And you find out throughout the book more about that, about why he's this way, why he has all of this beef with his coworkers and all this stuff.
Thanks.
But honestly, I felt like that was one of the weaker parts of this book, is when you finally found out. Like, not the scene where you found out about Painter's tragic backstory and all that, like, because that was really good. But just the fact that it takes you so long to find out Painter's tragic backstory and figure out what's going on, because I feel like you can't really start his arc very well until you have that background information, and because it was left to, like, almost the end as a dramatic twist, he just felt flatter throughout the book.
It did take a while.
And I feel like that could have been done a lot better if it had been revealed sooner rather than later, so that you could spend more time working through the problems instead of keeping the problem as a surprise. And then, now that we've talked about Yumi and 𝐂𝐿𝐄 the painter, talking about them together, because this is a fantasy romance book, and there is quite a lot of romance. Is it like romance in the traditional romance sense? You can tell that Brandon Sanderson doesn't have the most experience writing romance.
I thought it was really good.
It's like there needs to be more flirting and more angst and more like attention devoted to that plot. I felt like it was a little lacking for how integral the stakes of the book were. Most of the stakes of this book are hanging on this romance, and yet I feel like the romance itself didn't get enough development to hold all of that weight.
Because at first, when they were interacting with each other, they were both just really irritated at each other. Because Nicaro had his whole problem that he was dealing with, but now he doesn't have a body anymore, so he can't fix it. And then Yumi had her whole problem that she's dealing with, but she doesn't have a body anymore, so she can't deal with it. Instead, they have to like trust each other to help deal with it, and they don't know anything. And
I feel like most of my disappointment about the romance was because he hyped it up for me so much. It's like, Chloe, you need to read this, it's the best romance ever! And then I had too high of expectations when at the heart of it, it's really a Brandon Sanderson book. Maybe it's the best romance Brandon Sanderson has ever written. But he's not a romance author. Which one would you like better?
I would say Vin and Alette is written better.
I'd say this is written better than that, but I would say Wax and Steris is better than this one.
Wax and Steris is pretty good too.
Anyway, but it's definitely top tier of the romances Brandon Sanderson has written, and yet it's still not, like, I wouldn't go to someone who read a lot of romance novels and say, here is another great romance novels with fantasy in it. I feel like it's a fantasy novel with a really strong romance plot. But first, it's a fantasy novel.
I thought it was great.
They can touch spirits, and they can intellectually, emotionally interact with each other, but they can't physically touch each other. And I feel like I needed more pining. You know, I needed more like, oh, I wish I could be with her, and I needed more flirting, and... Okay, let me just talk about the positives of the romance for a little bit, because I've been harping too much on things I didn't like about it. And actually, in general, I would give it positive marks. Painter and Yumi fit very well together. Like, I can tell why they really appreciate each other's company.
There's definitely a lot of chemistry.
Work well as a couple. I appreciated on Yumi's world, there were a lot of scenes of them bathing together, which is most of the angst and tension in that way we get. It felt very intimate for them to, like, go from nervous and angry at each other and like, oh, we have to do this together, blah, 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 into, okay, now we're comfortable with each other and it's actually something we look forward to. And that was a nice journey to watch. I felt like that was kind of the encapsulation of looking at their romantic relationship development.
And eventually they do end up going on a couple dates. The carnival that he ends up taking her to, where they have a whole bunch of fun playing carnival games, and they go on like a Ferris wheel, and they have this cute romantic moment at the top.
The romantic moment at the top of the Ferris wheel, yes, perfect. The carnival scene, for other reasons, completely bothered me, because a lot of it was just like, Yumi being like, what is a game? And then Painter being like, this is what a game is. And I'm like, both these characters have transformed into Brandon Sanderson. Like, I can't.
I thought it worked fine because it just made sense to me that she wouldn't really know what goes on in a festival or a carnival, because she'd never been to one. She's been very secluded her whole life.
But she's really good at rock stacking. Looking at the whole book, it definitely feels very much like it's written for now. There's a plot that happens on Yumi's world where there's a machine that stacks rocks in order to replace the 𝐂𝐿𝐒, Yumi's job. This book kind of thematically becomes about AI taking over artists' jobs through that. And it was like almost like a twist thematically, because I wasn't expecting this book to be about that, but in the end, like, this book is really exploring ideas of like, why is art important? Why is it important for people to do it? What does art mean? And you can see that both on Yumi with her battle with the rock stacking robot, and also with Painter as he tries to reclaim the adventure in his own art and getting out of just the rote, drawing the same thing over and over, pattern that he had been in before, and finds like the soul of his art again.
Regaining his passion.
I did appreciate the thematic richness of this book, the more it kind of discussed of like, this art is important because a person is making it, right? The rock stacking of Yumi is more powerful than the rock stacking of a robot because she can put her heart into it. The paintings that Nicaro does with his heart in it are way more powerful magically than the ones he's just doing by rote.
I also personally found it really interesting. I started reading the book, and I think the first character you get to know is Painter, and you're like, oh yeah, he paints like bamboo to capture these nightmares. That makes sense. Yeah, that's totally art. Okay, check, move on. And then you get to Yumi's chapter, and her whole society art is stacking rocks, and I was just like, really? Rock stacking.
Rock stacking.
That's what you've chosen. Oh, okay. interesting. But then by the end of the book, I'm like, yes, stack those rocks. Yeah, take that one and put it on top of the other one.
I believe the rock stacking scenes, like, were so entertaining and had me on the edge of my seat, and, like, it's amazing that the author managed to do this with rock stacking.
It was really cool.
I think one of these decades, people are going to look back at all of the art produced in these years and be like, this is the art movement that was in response to the rise of AI art. And this book will be like something that people hold up as like, look, it's this. And it feels kind of weird to be like living through this and being able to so obviously see like, this is a book in response to AI art, and being like, actually, that's not how we should be doing art, you know? And right now, it feels like really on the nose, but I can see this like being taught at schools in like 50 years. It just feels like such a good teaching tool where it's not so simple that it's like boring, but it's simple enough that you can grasp.
Yeah, it is a little on the nose, but not necessarily because the book itself goes too far, but just because that's the current problem, or one of the current problems that we're living through right now, and we deal with it all the time. Eventually, I think that problem will go away. As for the wider Cosmere Connections, like, what books do you need to read before you read this one? Honestly, none.
But there's quite a lot of references and Easter eggs to pretty much every single Cosmere book.
Yes.
So you definitely catch them if you've read all the other Cosmere books.
But they aren't necessary.
I think one of the linchpins of the Cosmere Connections is this is narrated by Hoid, who is a character that is in every single Cosmere book. And he's telling the story to someone on the planet Roshar, which is the Stormlight Archive books. Stepping outside as people on Earth, reading these books, and like, you're clarifying the magic of one fantasy world by comparing it to the magic of a different fantasy world when your readers might not have read them, so like, that could get a little confusing, but I think you'd pick it up.
Yeah,
you might be a little like, what?
It's nothing too crazy. Like, for example, one that happens in the book, both Painter and Yumi's people eat like this kind of rice that's like purple and stuff. Hoid is like, oh yeah, they had this plant that you wouldn't really know here on Roshar. Over on Scadrial, they'd call it rice, but you'd call it this other thing. But it's a little like thinner and like it's different. And so he goes through this whole rigmarole of trying to explain rice to people who don't know what rice is by comparing it to this other fictional plant, which I thought was fun.
But also, if you hadn't read all those books, it would just be like, what? Why are we having this aside?
I know what rice is.
You could just say rice, no explanation needed. You could even say purple rice, no more explanation needed.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I really liked about this book, especially over the other book that we recently got that was narrated by Hoid, Tress of the Emerald Sea, is that Hoid isn't a character in this book. Like in Tress, by the end of the book, Hoid is like the main character of the story, actually. In this book, does literally nothing.
He just narrates. Which, yes, was much of an improvement over Tress of the Emerald Sea, where I have a lot of problems with him, like, getting a bigger and bigger role in the book, and I feel like he really took over the plot in a way that didn't serve the characters or the themes of that book. But in this book, I also have problems with Hoid narrating, because I feel like there's too many asides. Like, we don't need a page of him describing rice. Like, it distracts from the story actually being told, and I feel like Hoid just has too much of a personality, too much of, like, Cosmere Connections knowledge that he's always shoving in. The worst Hoid moment of this book was near the end. It's a Brandon Sanderson book, and there's some very nice twists. And some of the twists get kind of confusing. So after we have had a kind of info dump from the characters explaining the twist, we then get a several page info dump from Hoid re-explaining the twist to us and how it all works. And like, I wanted to scream at the book. Like, we do not need a second set of info dump pages from a character that isn't relevant to the story at all, explaining it more poorly. This book and Tress of the Emerald Sea is like trying so hard to like kind of include Hoid's quirkiness in the narration, and I feel like it just distracts from the story being told. Like, it doesn't contribute positively to my enjoyment at all.
I really liked it.
It does contribute positively to your enjoyment, apparently.
Yes.
No, and I think I am in the minority that most people really like the character of Hoid and appreciate his asides, but I personally felt like, especially near the climax of this book, explaining all the twists, like, it just completely wrecked the pacing and the emotional tension and stakes in those scenes.
The pacing does get a little wonky towards the end, but there was definitely someone that needed to explain what happened, because it's very confusing.
But it could have been the person person that was already monologuing that was in the scene.
The person who was already monologuing, though, didn't have an in-world reason for explaining it. It would have been out of character for
It
that.
would have been better than a different narrator coming in and doing it anyway. The place where I really like Hoid is in the Stormlight Archive, where he's just like a side character that's just like dispensing advice and stories. And in that place, I really like him because he's just like a side character and not the narrator of the book. And I feel like that's the role that Design is playing in this book, which is a character I love.
I was just about to mention that Design is just about as relevant to this book as Hoid is to Stormlight.
Yeah. So Design is one of Hoid's sidekicks. So in this book, she is an actual character. She runs the noodle shop that they're always going to dinner at.
Over on Painter's World. And so characters get to interact with her all the time. She's actually able to see both Yumi and Painter in like their ghost versions because she's really eccentric, but she also knows a lot of stuff. And so they're able to come to her with advice if there's like some weird thing going on. And usually she's like, I don't know.
But then she says something useful and it like conveys more of the plot. Yeah.
She's really a great character in this book.
That level of quirkiness and entertainment I really like.
Another one of the bigger Cosmere connections is we get a new shard. I believe this is number 15 of the 16. We're only missing one now. Virtuosity. And this isn't virtuosity as in like virtue. It's virtuosity as in like virtuoso. Both planets are very much inspired by like art and how they're doing art. Virtuosity herself has like splintered at this point, so it's only like her little spirit wisps.
And all the magic is so centered on art because of this god shard that is ruling over these planets. Really, I love this magic system. Of all the Brandon Sanderson magic systems, I think the ones fueled by artistic passion are my favorite right now.
And another thing that I really liked about how virtuosity was handled is that, you know, in some of the other books, especially like Stormlight, the shards are characters in the book that are like actively working on things, which works really well for those books. This wouldn't have been one of them. And I'm glad that virtuosity didn't really get anything more than a passing mention.
But it's definitely very cool from a Cosmere perspective to be like, yes, these are definitely the art planets.
And then some other little quick things there's a Sleepless, for those of you who've read Dawn Shard. Very interestingly, for people who really know the Cosmere really well, the Shodel also make an appearance. Those are like the four-armed people from Hoid's planet.
Just a very small mention.
Just a very small mention, but they do technically make an appearance. Then another bigger thing is that this location gets mentioned, the Iron 7 way station, which is implied to be a space station out in the middle of nowhere in space, which we can use to kind of pin this in more of like Era 4 Cosmere, where, you know, Scadrians have like developed space travel and are going off doing stuff.
Because if the space station is named Iron,
it's gonna be the metal people.
But definitely compared to other Brandon Sanderson books, I'd say the ones that this feels most like is one, Tress of the Emerald Sea, because they have the same narrator and a lot of the same style. It's written around the same time.
And Warbreaker.
Warbreaker, because it's got a lot of romance and kind of like different cultures intersecting kind of feeling. But I feel like this book, in comparison to Warbreaker, one, it's shorter, and two, I also feel like it's tighter. Like we only have the two protagonists instead of splitting it along more, and the two protagonists are working on the same problem. So there's, instead of like 4 different tracks, like in Warbreaker, there's just one track of plot.
I know you really like Warbreaker.
I do.
But in my opinion, Warbreaker is one of the worst Cosmere books, and I loved this one.
You just couldn't stand Vivenna, which, fair.
Fair.
Vivenna's very annoying.
Anyway.
So, finishing up, what would you rate this book?
5 stars. Easy.
Read it twice in 1 week. I would give it 4 stars. I loved it, but I wasn't obsessed with it. And honestly, if I had been reading this by myself, I probably would have only given it 3 stars, like just like level, not yet to love. But the fact that I was reading it with you and got to geek out with you and see all your theories and this and that, like that made it a lot of fun. So it upgrades it to 4 stars.
And I think something that probably played into my enjoyment as well is a while ago, I lived in Japan for like 2 years. So I got to see a whole bunch of cool little, like, oh yeah, I feel like I've maybe been to this place before.
Yeah, but overall, definitely, I would recommend this book to people of fantasy lovers, and maybe if you're a romance lover looking to branch out to more of the fantasy side of fantasy romance, it could also work. Or just Brandon Sanderson lovers, like, if this book is very much a Brandon Sanderson book and feels like it. Like, I feel like for a while in this book, I was like lulled into a false sense of like security because it didn't feel that much like a Brandon Sanderson Sanderson book for a while.
Because interestingly enough, there isn't really a whole lot of external conflict.
Not really for like the first 2/3 of the book, and then you start getting into like all the twists and the plot, and like wow, there's so much plot all at once, and then you get the Sanderlanche. So so it definitely is Brandon Sanderson all over it. Thank you for watching.